In this true crime compilation, we'll explore some of the darkest cases we've covered so far this year. From deadly widows to a family tragically wiped out. From the Victorian era to cases that continue to rumble on to this day. I'd like to begin by saying thank you to our channel members and patrons whose support allows us to travel to some of the locations featured in the cases we cover. For instance, we were recently able to head south to bring you the tragic story of the Brighton babes in the wood. On October 9th, 1986, 10-year-old Nicola Fellows and 9-year-old Karen Hathaway met after school to play. The girls were best friends who lived close to each other on the Moulsecoombe Council estate but attended different schools, so it was typical for the pair to spend their afternoons together. On this particular day, the girls walked to the Lewes Road area where they bought chips to share. A teenage acquaintance of the girls told them to get home before their parents were worried, but Nicola was overheard telling Karen they should go over to the park. The park Nicola was referring to was Wild Park, a sprawling, densely wooded nature reserve the children were expressly forbidden to visit. Around 6:40 p.m, as darkness descended that evening, the girls were spotted playing near the area. It was the last time they would be seen alive. When the girls weren't home by bedtime, Karen's mother, Michelle Hathaway, called 999 to report them missing. The next day, a massive search party of some 200 police officers and volunteers scoured the park and surrounding areas. Among the searchers was 20-year-old Russell Bishop, who offered to use his terrier Misty, claiming she was a trained tracking dog. After hours of searching the dense undergrowth, Bishop told a passing constable he was going to head home. When the constable pressed him to search the woods a while longer, Bishop responded, saying he was worried that if he found the girls and they had been killed, people would suspect him of the crime. The constable took note of the odd comment, mentally adding Bishop to a growing list of people to question should the worst outcome be confirmed. Shortly after, 2 teenage boys discovered the bodies of Karen and Nicola in a wooded den deep in the park. The 2 girls were lying close together, looking at first glance as if they had simply nestled together and drifted off to sleep. The falsely idyllic tableau earned the nickname Babes in the Wood. But there was nothing peaceful about the way Karen and Nicola had died. Both had been assaulted and strangled. After finding the bodies, the 2 teenagers ran from the wooded den, shouting for help. Russell Bishop, searching nearby with his dog, ran toward the crime scene along with several officers. Later, Bishop would claim he checked the girls' necks for signs of a pulse, but witnesses did not remember him ever approaching the bodies directly. The discovery of such a horrific crime shocked and terrified the Brighton community. Parents were warned to keep their children indoors after dark as swarms of police officers canvassed neighbourhoods and stopped cars on the road. The wooded den where the girls' bodies were found was remote, hidden, almost invisible. Whoever put the bodies there knew the area well, which meant whoever had killed Nicola and Karen was most likely a local. Russell Bishop quickly became a suspect for the murders. He had been seen in the area on the same evening the girls had died, and police were suspicious of his involvement in the search. When the bodies had been discovered, he had shown little interest or surprise. Combined with his strange comment about fearing becoming a suspect, his behavior was enough to pique police interest. Russell was a local out-of-work roofer and petty thief. He had ties to both girls' families. He played cricket with Nicola's dad, Barry, and his friend was lodging with the Fellows family at the time of the murder. The girls had also run errands for Russell and his girlfriend, Jenny Johnson, though their parents had warned them not to trust them. He and Jenny had one child together and another one on the way. but rumours swirled on the housing estate that he was having an affair with a 16-year-old girl. Bishop's statements on both his whereabouts on the day of the girl's murder and his behaviour during the search were often contradictory and ever-changing. Investigators had an unshakable hunch that he was the killer, but they needed evidence. And when a blue Pinto brand jumper was unearthed from the lost property box, they knew they just might have it. The pale blue jumper had been found lying on a path near the Mulscombe railway station shortly after the murders. It was discovered on the same route Russell Bishop walked home from Wild Park. What was first believed to be bloodstains on the sweatshirt turned out to be a very specific shade of red paint, a shade that coincidentally was found on the shelf of a friend's auto repair shop where Bishop often had his red Ford Cortina worked on. Fibres and ivy spores on the sweater matched the wooded den where the bodies had been found. And when police knocked on Bishop's door with the sweater in hand, Jenny Johnson exclaimed, "Oh good, you found Russell's sweater." Now confident that they had sufficient evidence, Sussex police arrested Russell Bishop and charged him with the murders of Karen Hadaway and Nicola Fellows on December the 3rd. But at trial, the prosecution's case fell apart. The forensics team had failed to determine an accurate time of death for the two girls, but the prosecution suggested they had likely been killed around 6:30 p.m. Witnesses testified to seeing the girls alive closer to 6:40, allowing the defence to poke holes in the timeline and for Russell Bishop's spotty alibi to go unchallenged. And when Jenny Johnson took the stand to testify about Russell's blue sweatshirt, she shocked the prosecution by claiming that she had been bullied into saying the clothing belonged to Russell. The Pinto sweatshirt, she said, did not belong to her boyfriend. The presiding judge gave the jury explicit instructions. Be sure the girls were dead by 6:30. If not, acquit. After just 2 hours of deliberations, the jury returned with a verdict of not guilty. The outcome was devastating for the Fellows and Hadaway families. With no other suspects or leads, Sussex police were forced to tell the families the unthinkable. They knew who the killer was, but they would never be able to hold him accountable. Shockingly, Russell Bishop himself was one of the first to mount a campaign for the case to be reopened. His name wouldn't truly be cleared, he said, until someone else was convicted of the double murder. And he had a suspect of his own in mind, Barry Fellows. Eager to divert suspicion away from himself, Bishop had spent the months after the murder spreading rumours about Nicola's father, attempting to convince anyone who would listen that Barry had killed the girls to stop them from reporting him for sexual abuse. The Fellows' home, where they had erected a makeshift shrine to their daughter, was graffitied with phrases like "child killer" and "Fellows should hang." At trial, Bishop's defence had offered up Barry as another possible suspect, while Bishop was presented as a hero who helped police find the girls' bodies. The harassment became unbearable, and the Fellows family moved away, following the Hadaways, who had already left the estate in the months after the murder. Sussex police had been devastated by the verdict, not just because Nicola and Karen's family were denied justice, but because they believed Russell Bishop would strike again. And on February the 4th, 1990, that's exactly what happened. Rachel Watts was new to Brighton, her family having just moved to the White Hawk estate days before, when the 7-year-old strapped on her roller skates and asked her dad for £1 to spend at the sweet shop. The young girl, whose anonymity was protected until she shared her story publicly in 2022, got turned around after finding that the sweet shop was closed. She saw Russell Bishop nearby, working on his car, and asked him for directions. He reminded her of her dad, who also had a mustache and tinkered on his vehicle. She felt like she could trust him. Instead, Bishop grabbed the girl and locked her in the trunk of his red Ford Cortina before driving off. In the terrifying darkness, Rachel removed her roller skates so she could run when the trunk was opened. She found a hammer, which she used to bang on the trunk's interior, hoping someone nearby would hear. Bishop stopped the car at Devil's Dyke here on the Sussex Downs. He dragged Rachel into the back seat, assaulted her, and then strangled her. Believing her to be dead, he disposed of her unclothed body in a clump of gorse bushes and drove away. But Rachel regained consciousness and flagged down a couple for help. 3 days later, she would pick Bishop out of a police lineup without hesitation. The brave child would go on to testify at his trial, resulting in Russell Bishop being convicted of kidnap, assault, and attempted murder, ultimately being sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum of 13 years. He was finally off the streets and safely behind bars, but the nightmare was not over for the Fellows and the Hadaway families. Lee Hadaway passed away in 1998, never seeing his daughter's killer brought to justice. Michelle Hadaway, Barry and Susan Fellows lived in fear of the parole board granting Bishop release. The Fellows moved to London for a fresh start. However, their grief pulled them apart and they divorced. And in 2009, Barry was arrested on suspicion of conspiracy to rape his daughter. Douglas Judd, the former lodger and friend of Russell Bishop, was arrested on the same day on suspicion of rape. The allegations were made by Bishop's former girlfriend, who had found some media attention when she told the same story to a tabloid years before. The men were both released without being charged. Russell Bishop still had reason to hope Barry Fellows would at the least be maligned again. In 2002, Sussex police began reviewing the Babes in the Wood case after the government's plan to abolish the double jeopardy rule was announced. From then on, Bishop likely knew that his guilt hung in the balance, coming closer with each new improvement in DNA testing technology. The process of retrying him for the murders of Nicola Fellows and Karen Hadaway was not as simple as rectifying the mistakes of the first trial. For a case to be retried, new compelling evidence against the acquitted person must be presented. Convincing Jenny to testify that the sweatshirt had belonged to Russell was not new evidence, nor was any evidence that existed at the time of the first trial, but was not presented. The standard for evidence to grant a new trial is high, and it would take years before investigators were even ready to try. In August 2012, cold case specialist Roy Green took possession of boxes of evidence from the forensic archive related to the case. When Detective Superintendent Jeff Riley was appointed Senior Investigating Officer in the cold case the following year, he had some ideas for those boxes of evidence. Green extracted DNA matching Russell Bishop from the cuff of the Pinto sweatshirt. It seemed like the answer everyone had been waiting for. However, forensics experts could not conclusively rule out the possibility of contamination. The blue sweatshirt had been examined on a table next to other evidence, and there was a possibility, however slight, that the sweatshirt had been contaminated. An acquitted defendant can only be retried for the same crime once, even under the new double jeopardy laws. There was no room for mistakes. The new and compelling evidence Riley had counted on was too risky to pin their case on. It would take another 2 years for Riley to get what was needed to apply for a new trial. In June 2015, Green found fibers and DNA to link Bishop, the victims, and the sweatshirt. Fibers on the blue sweatshirt matched a sock and 2 other sweaters found in Bishop's home. His blue sweatshirt also yielded fibers that matched the clothing worn by Nicola and Karen. Plus, fibres from the blue sweatshirt were found on Nicola and Karen's skirts, t-shirts and underwear. DNA collected from the inside of the blue sweatshirt was matched to Bishop and Jenny, and hair recovered from the garment was another match to Bishop. More DNA was collected from the then 30-year-old, samples that had been taken from the victim's skin during their post-mortems. Swabs from tapings of Karen's left arm matched Bishop's DNA. Armed with new and compelling evidence, Riley submitted the case for consideration of a second trial. A year later, Russell Bishop was rearrested for the murders. He remained defiant, denying any involvement with the murders beyond being a concerned neighbour who helped with the search. But during his second murder trial in 2018, the prosecution ensured the jury saw clearly who Russell Bishop really was. While he claimed his DNA was present because he had checked for a pulse on each of the girls, witnesses who were with him when the bodies were found testified that he never got near them. The jury also learned about Bishop's unsettling comments during the search and his cold lack of interest once the crime scene had been discovered. The prosecution also corrected the timeline of the murders, now having advanced technology that showed the girls were still alive at 6:30 p.m., allowing time for Bishop to turn back into Wild Park and kill them after they were last sighted. The jury learned that Bishop had been to the fellow's house earlier that day to see his friend Douglas, who lived there. He had his 16-year-old girlfriend with him, and Nicola called her a slag. Likely, the 10-year-old didn't know what the word even meant, but Russell Bishop had a history of doling out punishments. He admitted to the jury that he had abducted Rachel Watts in 1990, but explained that his actions weren't sexual in nature. He wanted to belittle and shame the girl, he said, after he thought he'd heard her make a snide comment about his car repairs. It didn't take a leap of judgment to imagine a man like that could assault and kill a child who called his girlfriend a mean name. The prosecution questioned him about letters he had written to a 13-year-old while in jail awaiting his first murder trial. Bishop had known the girl since she was 11 when he had babysat her. The letters were sexually suggestive and provided strong evidence that Bishop was grooming the child. Again, his defense relied on casting suspicion on Barry Fellows, but this time it backfired. When Barry testified, the jury saw not a possible suspect, but a grieving father who had again offered himself up to horrific public scrutiny in order to get justice for his daughter. Barry was broken and angry, but he was at court every day. Bishop, on the other hand, gave evidence in his defense, but did not return for cross-examination, and then was absent for the rest of the trial. The visible difference in character between the two men left no doubt in the jury's minds about who was guilty. In an ironic twist, the jury deliberated almost the same amount of time as in Bishop's first trial. But this time, they returned with a guilty verdict. The date was December the 10th, 2018, precisely 31 years since he was acquitted in 1987. The next day, Russell Bishop was sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 36 years. Following the verdict, Michelle Hadaway told reporters, "After 32 years of fighting, we finally have justice for Karen and Nicola." Time stood still for us in 1986. And the Fellows family said in a statement, "The guilty verdict doesn't bring Nicola and Karen back, but we know that other children are now safe from the hands of Russell Bishop. He is a monster." In May 2021, Bishop's former girlfriend, Jenny Johnson, was convicted of perjury and perverting the course of justice for her testimony at Bishop's first murder trial. She was sentenced to 6 years in prison. Russell Bishop died from cancer on January the 20th, 2022. He was 55 years old. Whilst Nicola and Karen's families say they are relieved that Bishop is no longer alive. It does seem profoundly unfair that he did only serve 4 years for his horrendous murders, whilst the fellows and the Hadaway families have had to endure a quite horrendous 32-year wait for justice. We were also able to head on location for our next case, this time to the small village of Beenham, where, in the 1960s, the peace and tranquility were shattered by several shocking murders. Yolanda Waddington was just 17 years old when she accepted a job working as a nanny for a family here in Beenham, a tiny village just 6 miles east of Newbury, Berkshire. Peter and Rosemary Jagger had previously hired short-term au pairs for their 18-month-old daughter. They were excited to employ a local woman who may well stay with their baby as it grew into childhood. Yolanda was eager to leave her job as a petrol pump attendant in Newbury, but pleased to stay close to home, where her parents, 2 younger brothers, and boyfriend all lived. She started her new role on October the 23rd, 1966, and was immediately thrilled with the arrangements. The Jaggers lived in a lovely historic farmhouse called Oakwood on the outskirts of Beenham. Rosemary and Peter were happy to give their new nanny her freedom, and she told one friend she was allowed to stay out until 2 a.m., a privilege she'd never experienced under her parents' roof. The infant in her care was sweet and happy. The Jaggers were happy with their new hire too. Yolanda came from a good family. She was polite, she was amiable, and at the same time, she was unafraid to stand up for herself. Rosemary found her to be a fast learner, and she enjoyed taking walks in the evening. After her 4th day on the job, she announced to the family she was going to walk a few miles on the farm road. Rosemary was alarmed since it was already dark outside and the farm was in a remote area. She insisted Yolanda take Elizabeth Roche, the German au pair who was to depart soon, with her. The 2 young women walked down the rutted roads to town, stopping at the Six Bells pub, where they sat for a while before returning to Oakwood Farm. On Thursday, Waddington visited her family in Newbury and told them how much she enjoyed her new job. The following day, October the 28th, Elizabeth Roche departed, and Yolanda spent her free time in the morning writing a letter to her boyfriend. That evening, just before 10, she told the Jaggers she wanted to post her letter, and though Rosemary was hesitant, the pub was only open until 11, and she didn't expect the nanny to be out late. The Jaggers told her to come straight back and gave her a key to unlock the French windows when she returned. Yolanda reached the Six Bells at approximately 10:35 and was noticed by the locals, some of whom, of course, were still fascinated by the newcomer. She posted her letter and purchased a packet of cigarettes, then sat alone at a table and smoked. She left soon afterwards and spoke to no one in the pub. On Saturday, October the 29th, Rosemary awoke to find Yolanda's bed unslept in. She hoped the young woman had spent the night with a friend, but when she wasn't back by midday, Rosemary contacted the police to report her missing. On Sunday morning, a few farm labourers at Hall Place Farm, owned coincidentally by Peter Jagger's father, stumbled across some blood-stained clothing among the hay bales in the cowshed. When Peter Jagger heard of the discovery, he rushed to the neighbouring property. He immediately recognised the blue jeans and sweater Yolanda had been wearing when she left on Friday night. The men searched the barn and nearby fields for more clues, and Peter found the body of Yolanda Waddington lying in a ditch. Her body was undressed, with a sweater knotted around her face. She'd been stabbed twice in her torso, but the wounds were superficial. The cause of death was strangulation with coconut fibre baling twine. The same type of fibre had been used to bind her wrists. The grisly murder put the tiny village of Beenham into a tailspin. Such things simply didn't happen in their community. The only murder anyone could remember was when a barmaid had been killed by soldiers during the Civil War of 1642. Local law enforcement and officers from Scotland Yard quickly mounted an investigation, but the scene held few clues. Plaster casts of tyre tracks were taken from the lane near the barn, and the 60 tons of hay stored in the cowshed were combed through for evidence. Airmen from the base at Greenham Common were employed using mine detectors to search for the knife used in the attack, which was believed to be a kitchen knife. Everyone who had been at the Six Bells on the evening of the murder was thoroughly questioned and investigated. In the end, investigators turned up a pack of cigarettes, a knife blade, an earring, some loose change and the keys to the Jaggers' French windows from the barn and the area near the ditch. They established that Yolanda had last been seen at the Six Bells around 10:30. She hadn't met anyone there or even spoken to anyone save the publican to purchase her cigarettes. Investigators believed that Yolanda had been killed sometime between 10:30 and midnight and thought that more than one person might have been involved. The clothing in the barn contained blood that belonged to the victim and an unidentified person, leading investigators to believe there had been a struggle before she was murdered. Investigators spoke with Elizabeth Roche and another former au pair named Sonia, who both denied having witnessed any strange men near the farmhouse. Sonia did say she had several inappropriate run-ins with Peter Jagger, including a time she'd found him lying on her bed, and another when he tried to remove her top. But there was nothing to suggest Peter had left Oakwood on the night of Yolanda's murder, nor made sexual advances towards her in the days leading up to it. Scotland Yard was sure the killer was someone local, familiar with the dark, rutted roads between town and Oakwood Farm. The barn where Yolanda's clothing was found was rumoured to have been a well-known spot for teenagers to, quite literally, roll in the hay. But the residents of Beenham were confident the murderer could not be among their tiny number. They believed it had been the work of a drifter or hitchhiker. In fact, locals were so eager to clear their town of suspicion that in November, more than 200 local men voluntarily gave blood samples in one of the first mass blood tests of its type in UK history. No match for the blood on Yolanda's clothing was found, and in April 1967, the inquest into the murder was concluded. Beenham residents were disturbed by the unsettled nature of the crime, but felt sure it was the work of a passing madman, now safely far removed from their quiet village. But just days after the investigation was closed, 2 more murders cleaved the healing town in two. On April the 17th, 1967, 9-year-old friends Jeanette Wigmore and Jacqueline Williams walked up Webb's Lane to collect Jeanette's bicycle and ride together to the gravel pits. The friends were in the same class at the village primary school and usually played together in the evenings, sometimes joined by Jacqueline's younger sister. Just after 5, Jeanette's father, Tony, spotted the girls playing together in a field near the house. At about 5:30, a schoolmate saw them wheeling their bikes in the direction of the gravel pits. Blake's gravel pit had been out of use for over a year, and as so often happens in small towns with little to do, was quickly taken over by the local children. The pit was now home to a tin shack turned playhouse, numerous dirt mounds made by little hands and small ponds where Jeanette and Jacqueline liked to collect frog spawn. The Mayridge gravel pit across the road was still open, but the workers paid little mind to the kids nearby. When Jeanette had not returned home by 6:45, Tony became worried and decided to drive around and see if he could give her a ride home. He first checked the Williams house, then remembered Jeanette telling him about the frog spawn at Blake's pit. As dusk settled, he parked his car on the access road and walked toward the pit. He found the girls' bikes and then found Jeanette lying face down in a shallow pool of water. Shocked and struggling to make sense of what he was seeing, he moved his lifeless daughter to the grass and ran for help. By then, Teddy Williams was growing worried too. He set off on his own search shortly after Tony stopped by and soon discovered that Jeanette had been found dead. He ran into the Stocks pub and told the crowded room that one girl was dead and his daughter was still missing. The regulars quickly abandoned their drinks and headed to the gravel pits to search. The police had arrived after being summoned by Tony Wigmore, and the area was cordoned off and flooded with searchlights. It was nearly 11 when an officer waded into a pool full of leaves, twigs and decaying vegetable matter and felt his foot brush against something solid. Beneath the plant matter was the body of Jacqueline Williams. Autopsies showed that Jeanette had been stabbed 5 times. Jacqueline had been seized by the throat until unconscious and then drowned in a shallow pool. Evidence collected from the bodies suggested that Jacqueline had been sexually assaulted and then murdered first. Investigators believed the killer then realized Jeanette had witnessed the crime and killed her. This time, the villagers did not distance themselves from the crime. Yolanda Waddington had been a newcomer, an outsider. Her murder was easier to write off as an anomaly. But Jeanette and Jacqueline were local children, known and loved by all. The people of Beenham knew there was a killer in their midst who'd taken 3 lives already and could strike again at any given moment. A questionnaire was prepared for each resident to establish exactly where they had been between the hours of 5:30 and 6:30 p.m. on the evening of April the 17th. Investigators sifted through every square inch of the massive gravel pit for evidence, and searchers cut down every bit of vegetation in the area looking for the murder weapon. By the time they were done processing the crime scene, it looked like a barren moonscape. On April the 20th, a blue overcoat and a pair of trousers, both mud-stained, were found by a journalist as he walked through the woods near the crime scene. The next day, the discovery was buzzing around the 6 Bells, where the flood of journalists mingled with locals to discuss the case. One reporter interviewed a man who worked at the gravel pits across from the murder scene. The man told the reporter 4 policemen had come to his house to question him. He said he'd also been interviewed by the police after the Yolanda Waddington murder, after he'd told them he'd lost a knife similar to the one used in the attack. That man was David Burgess, a 19-year-old who lived with his parents and 2 younger brothers in a council house on the Stonyfield estate in Beenham. David was born and raised in the village, a local through and through. He'd been an average student and left school at 15 to take a job on a farm. He had a few close friends and went on dates, but had never had a long-term relationship. David's biggest interest was poaching, and he was a skilled rabbit catcher. He took a job at the gravel pits alongside his older brother John and was a regular at the 6 Bells. His most discernible physical feature was a glass eye, the result of an accident with an air rifle when he was a youngster. David was questioned by police 2 days after the murder as a matter of routine, having been listed as working near the pit where the bodies were found. He told the detectives that he had left the pit only briefly around 6 to check the rabbit snares he'd placed in a small copse of trees near the bank of the pit. When police asked if he happened to own a sharp single-ended instrument, Burgess showed them a broken metal pocket knife. His statement did not raise any red flags, so police moved on to other suspects. But a few days later, Burgess ran into the officers in Reading and shared a pint with them before asking for a lift home. Relaxed by ale and the success of his first interview, he mentioned to the officers that it was an odd coincidence that he'd been in such close proximity to the recent murders and had been drinking at the 6 Bells the night Yolanda Waddington was killed. He'd voluntarily submitted a blood sample and been eliminated as a suspect, along with dozens of others who'd been at the pub that night. But he also told officers that he'd heard from Jacqueline's father that he believed the killer was a poacher and showed off a new hunting knife he'd just purchased. It was enough to raise some eyebrows, and a few days later the investigators asked Burgess to give them the clothing he'd been wearing on the day of the murder. On May the 7th, David Burgess was asked to come in for another interview. This time, there was no friendliness or shared pints. The detectives produced the work boots he'd given them and showed him the test results that had just arrived. A blood stain on the side of his boot matched the very rare blood type of Jeanette Wigmore. Burgess then burst into tears and told the investigators that he'd heard a scream and rushed to the Blake pit, where he'd seen a man standing near Jeanette's body. He said the man had fled and he'd approached the girl and touched her, but ran when he realized she was dead. The story didn't account for the other test results the investigators were sitting on. Traces of human blood had been found on his jeans, along with a semen stain. This evidence, combined with testimony from David's brother stating he'd left the gravel pit for 10 to 20 minutes at the time of the murder, convinced a jury to convict David Burgess of both murders. He was sentenced to 2 life terms in prison. In 2010, Yolanda Waddington's case was reopened 44 years after her murder. Using advanced DNA technology, evidence from the original crime scene was retested. Burgess's DNA was found on Yolanda's headband, a comb, and a fertilizer sack collected from the cowshed. At a trial in 2012, Burgess was convicted of the 1966 crime, and the 64-year-old man was sentenced to another 27 years imprisonment. We now know that on the 20th of October 1966, David Burgess was drinking in the Six Bells when Yolanda Waddington went in to post her letter and purchase cigarettes. He watched her leave, then slipped away a few minutes later and caught up with Yolanda on the road to Oakwood Farm. Her killer was not a hitchhiker or a passing drifter. He was the local, the regular at the town pub, who committed 2 more murders as soon as he was cleared of the first. To the outside world, Mary Elizabeth Wilson seemed like any other sweet little old lady, but behind closed doors, she was a husband slayer who would earn the nickname the Merry Widow of Windy Nook. On October the 28th, 1957, the Alnwick Castle Hotel in Jarrow, South Tyneside hosted a small reception for a newlywed couple. The bride and groom were not fresh-faced youths glowing with the excitement of starting a family, but 68-year-old Mary Elizabeth and 76-year-old Ernest Wilson. Mary, short and stout with thick-framed spectacles and neat grey curls, may not have looked like a traditional bride, but she was flushed with excitement nonetheless as she passed around trays of food to her guests. One friend asked the bride what she planned to do with all the leftover sandwiches, and everyone laughed when Mary replied, "Keep them for the funeral." Mary's witty quip was quickly forgotten as friends toasted the newlyweds, but 2 weeks later, there was a funeral. Ernest Wilson was dead, having unknowingly wed the merry widow of Windy Nook, becoming her 4th victim in a 2-year killing spree. Mary Elizabeth Cassidy was born in 1889 in County Durham, a picturesque area of northeast England known for its dramatic coastal cliffs, old castles and historic market towns. As a teenager, Mary worked as a domestic servant before marrying John Knowles, a local chimney sweep, in 1914. According to some sources, John was the son of Mary's employers, and the two had been friends for many years before they married. The couple settled in Windy Nook, a small community in the county of Tyne and Wear. The pair had 6 children together, 2 of whom died in infancy. During the Second World War, Mary began working as a housekeeper for a painter and decorator named John Russell. It's believed that Russell eventually moved into the Knowles home as a lodger and began an affair with Mary after she separated from John in 1945. Though this sounds like the stuff of soap operas now, it was not uncommon for separated couples to continue living together, especially among the working class in rural areas. Divorce was financially and legally inaccessible to all but middle and upper-class men, and the strain of the war forced many couples to cohabitate for economic reasons. In some cases, their new romantic partners would move in to avoid paying living expenses at separate households. In August 1955, John Knowles died, apparently from tuberculosis. 5 months later, in January 1956, John Russell also passed away from what a physician ruled were natural causes. Widowhood was a lonely life. Mary's children were all grown and she'd lost her husband, lover and employer in the space of a few short months. In the post-war years, much emphasis was placed on supporting the widows of fallen soldiers who were now raising children alone. But women, like Mary, were for the most part overlooked. It's not clear what Mary's financial situation was after her husband's death and John Russell's, but we can surmise that, as the widow of a chimney sweep, she was not well heeled. So it was unsurprising when Mary quickly remarried. Her new husband was Oliver Leonard, a 76-year-old retired estate agent. Mary met Oliver through a friend, Mrs. Alice Mary Connolly. The older man was lodging with the Connollys in Hebburn, a few miles north of Windy Nook. According to Alice, Mary asked her, "Has that old so-and-so got any money?" And when Mrs. Connolly told her she thought he did, Mary asked to go in and see the poor old soul. Mary went to the Connollys to visit Oliver twice more, and within a week of meeting, the old man moved into Mary's house. But according to Mrs. Connolly, Mary soon began begging her friend to take him back. 3 or 4 days after Oliver moved in with her, Mary called on Mrs. Connolly and pleaded, "Get up there and get that old man out of my house. He won't sign any money over to me until I marry him." Mrs. Connolly said that she confided to Oliver what Mary had said, and they made arrangements for him to move back to the Connollys' house, but that on the day he was expected, Mary announced they were to be married. Mary's own account of her courtship wasn't much different. She said Oliver had begged her to allow him to move in with her, and I agreed to take him because he said he wanted peace and comfort. He was a bit bossy at first, and I got a bit fed up with him. I would have done anything to get shut of him. Despite their rocky start, Mary and Oliver married on September the 20th, 1956. Within days of their wedding, Mary arranged for James Hawes, an insurance agent, to meet with them. Mary explained to the agent that Oliver's will had already been amended to name her as his beneficiary, but she was also interested in securing life insurance for her new husband. Hawes told the newlyweds that at 76, Oliver was too old to qualify for a new life insurance policy. On October the 1st, Oliver had an appointment with his physician, Dr. John Leyden, who observed that his patient was a bit breathless and had some signs of chest and cardiac trouble. But Oliver was not feeble and was in generally good health for his age. The doctor prescribed cough medicine and sent his patient home to rest. 2 days later, Oliver Leonard was dead. According to later testimony, early on October the 3rd, Mary called a neighbour for help, saying that Oliver had fallen out of bed. After helping him up, the neighbour suggested that he be given a little brandy. Mary had no brandy in the house, but fixed her husband a cup of tea. When the neighbour handed Oliver the drink, he tasted it, spat it out, and knocked the cup from their hand, appearing quite delirious. Later, another neighbour, Mrs. Russell, was summoned by Mary to help. Mrs. Russell said Oliver appeared to be in pain, with his face twisted and him taking deep breaths. After 4 or 5 of these strange episodes, Oliver's head dropped and he became unresponsive. Mrs. Russell said that Dr. Leyden was called and examined the body, though in court the physician would adamantly deny ever having been to Oliver and Mary's house. Dr. Leyden insisted that he wrote the death certificate based on his examination of Oliver 2 days earlier. The cause of death was listed as myocardial degeneration and chronic nephritis. The following day, Oliver's sister, 83-year-old Emily Pettigrew, travelled from Jarrow to visit her brother and was shocked to discover that he was dead. According to Emily, Oliver was in good health apart from occasional chest complaints. He was buried on October the 5th in Hebburn Cemetery, and according to Emily, Mary was not in attendance. Following the death of her second husband, Mary quickly settled his financial affairs, collecting an inheritance of about £50, equivalent to around £1,000 today. A year later, she wed 76-year-old retired engineer Ernest George Lawrence Wilson. According to Mary, Ernest had told her as soon as they met that he had a plan to get married, and she agreed because the rent on her house was due to increase and it was becoming difficult to maintain on her own. After a simple ceremony and reception at the Alnwick Castle public house, the newlyweds retired to their home in Windy Nook. On November the 11th, Mary called Ernest's physician, Dr. William Wallace, and asked him to make a house call. Later, Dr. Wallace would describe that visit. When I got to the house, I found Wilson in bed. He said, "Why have you come?" and said that he didn't feel ill, but Mrs. Wilson said that he had had a nasty attack. Wilson was sitting up in bed smiling. I examined him and I found he was suffering from myocardial degeneration. Dr. Wallace prescribed some tablets to help with heart regulation. Around 10:15 the following morning, Dr. Wallace was again summoned to the house in Windy Nook. He said there was an urgent call from Mrs. Wilson saying that Mr. Wilson was probably dying and would I come at once. I went immediately and found Mr. Wilson dead. I examined the body and thought that he had been dead for 2 or 3 hours. Dr. Wallace filled out a death certificate listing the cause of death as cardiovascular failure. Mary told the doctor that her husband had gone out for a drink on Saturday night, then had gone straight to bed without eating supper, where he remained until he died on Tuesday. The evening after the death, Mary called on her friend Mrs. Liddell and asked if she could spend the night with her, as Ernest wasn't feeling well. Mrs. Liddell noticed that Mary had Ernest's gold watch with her, which Mary explained she was planning on selling. The next morning, Mary asked Mrs. Liddell to come home with her. Mrs. Liddell had expected Ernest to be sick in bed under the care of a doctor, but instead she found his body laid out on trestles and covered in a white sheet. When she expressed her shock at Mary's conflicting story of Ernest's illness, Mary told her that he died in hospital in Newcastle and his body had just been returned. Over the next few days, Mrs. Liddell accompanied Mary on many errands to handle Ernest's affairs. On the 13th, the women went into the Alnwick Castle Hotel, where Mary told the bar manager that Larry was very ill and had gone to the Queen Elizabeth Hospital the day before with a heart attack and stoppage in the bowels. Next, they visited the Windy Nook Industrial Cooperative Society and met with manager and secretary Joseph Milburn. Mary produced Ernest's share book, which had a balance of £100 along with his death certificate. She wanted to withdraw the balance, but Milburn told her a request would need to be filed with the probate office. On November the 15th, Mary and Mrs. Liddell were the only 2 mourners at Ernest's burial. On the 18th, the women collected about £10 from an insurance company. Mary would eventually receive just over £15 more from a death benefit. On November the 22nd, the pair went to the Longbank Society, where Mary attempted to withdraw some money from Ernest's passbook to pay for the burial fees, but was turned away. By this point, locals were beginning to talk about Mary's unbelievably bad luck. She'd lost 4 men who were close to her, including 3 husbands, within 2 years. Stranger still, she never seemed to grieve for long or at all before finding a new lover. Gossip about the unusual circumstances of Oliver Leonard and Ernest Wilson's deaths soon reached the police. On November the 29th, the bodies of Mary's 2 most recent husbands were exhumed for examination. A forensic pathologist found noticeably high levels of phosphorus in both men's intestines, along with wheat bran, both of which were used in the manufacture of common beetle and rat poisons. Mary was questioned by officers, and upon learning of the unusual findings, she said, "It must have been something they ate when they were out." Shortly after lunchtime on December the 11th, Mary's solicitor sought her out in the public house she'd been lodging at since the exhumation of her late husband's bodies. The solicitor warned her that the police would be there soon to arrest her. When the officers arrived, Mary calmly collected her hat and coat and went with them. She was charged with the murder of Ernest Wilson. A month later, an additional charge for the murder of Oliver Leonard was added. Mary maintained her innocence, saying, "I have prayed my good name be restored, and I am confident my prayers will be answered. I ask for no sympathy and will not give in to self-pity. All I want is for my name to be cleared and then to live out my life in peace." Mary's trial unfolded at the Leeds Assizes in March of 1958 and received international press coverage. It seemed impossible that the petite, grey-haired woman who looked like a stereotypical country granny was capable of the crimes described by the prosecutors. But even if the jurors were wary of the new forensic methods used to determine the men had been poisoned, testimony about Mary's behaviour following the deaths painted a grim picture. She told different people multiple accounts of the men's illnesses, had tried to sell their belongings, and had joked with the undertaker that she deserved a discount for all the business she sent his way. After deliberating for just 90 minutes, the jurors found Mary guilty of both murders, and she became the first person to be sentenced to death under the Homicide Act of 1957 for multiple charges. After Mary's appeal was rejected, her execution date was set for June the 4th, 1958 at Durham Prison. Public reaction to Mary's sentencing was mixed. Many were horrified by her crimes, while others sympathised with her position as a working-class elderly woman. The memory of Ruth Ellis, the last woman executed in England, was still fresh in many people's minds. 28-year-old Ellis had been sentenced to death for the shooting of her lover following a hasty trial. It wasn't until after the sentence was handed down that the public learned that Ellis had been brutally abused by the man she'd killed, appearing on the witness stand still covered in bruises. Despite hundreds of letters and petitions to the Home Office asking for a reprieve, Ellis was hanged at Holloway Prison just 3 months after the shooting. Following the execution, details about Ruth Ellis's tragic personal life continued to emerge. She'd been sexually and physically abused since childhood, beginning with her own father, and she'd been forced to take on morally questionable jobs to support her 2 children after their fathers refused to help pay for them. Outrage spread that Ellis's personal history, mental health, and abuse from her victim were not taken into consideration in her sentencing. Perhaps it was fear of eliciting a similar public reaction by executing a financially destitute old woman that led Home Secretary Rab Butler to recommend a reprieve for Mary Wilson shortly before her scheduled hanging. Her sentence was commuted to life in prison. That same summer, an inquest into the deaths of John Knowles and John Russell was opened, and their bodies were also exhumed. These two were found to contain trace evidence of phosphorus poisoning, but no charges were filed, with the inquest stating there was no evidence to show how this came to be administered. Mary died in Holloway Prison on December the 5th, 1962. Her family and friends who visited her during her final years said she remained in good spirits, laughing and joking as if she had no troubles. In letters, Mary continued to insist there had been a miscarriage of justice and argued that she should be allowed to move into an old people's home. The woman, who'd been dubbed the Merry Widow of Windy Nook, regretted the jokes she'd made about her own misfortune, telling a relative, "I may have said at the wedding reception that there were plenty of cakes and sandwiches that might come in useful for the funeral, but in no way was it intended to be taken so seriously." For all her troubles, Mary gained little in return. None of her victims were wealthy, and she inherited less than the modern equivalent of £3,000. Some have said this paltry sum makes Mary's crimes all the more deplorable. She had taken 4 lives in exchange for pocket change, but others believe it points to Mary's desperation. She was a woman too old to be deemed worthy of sympathy, isolated in a rural community with few ways to make a living. Her story forces us to reckon with the role societal circumstances play in shaping the decisions made by murderous women, and how those circumstances should be used in determining their punishment. Following Mary's reprieve, no other woman was ever sentenced to death or executed in Britain for murder, and the practice was abolished a few years after her death. Ironically, the Merry Widow who cruelly took 4 lives played an important part in saving the lives of all those convicted after her. We go even further back in time for our next case as we explore a murder that would not only go down in infamy, but also start an unlikely fashion trend. The expansion of the railway system was undoubtedly one of the crowning achievements of the Victorian era. Iron rails and steam-powered locomotives connected Britain in a way never before imagined. Journeys that once took weeks now took days. Goods that would have spoiled long before they could reach market were now whisked from the countryside into the cities within mere hours, and people were able to travel far distances for holidays. As trains were increasingly seen as a way to travel across cities as well as across the country, the number of passengers using the railways soared, with new stations appearing throughout London and the surrounding areas at breakneck pace. For all the convenience the railways provided, they also offered new opportunities for crime. Station platforms were crowded and noisy, making it easy for thieves to pick pockets, snatch purses and slip away into the mass of passengers. Early carriages were unlit, each a separate unit with no connecting corridors. Fistfights, vandalism and assaults were carried out between stations with no way to alert the crew. It didn't take long before the London papers were full of stories of mischief and mayhem on the rails. Many passengers were already concerned about the general safety of train travel. Accidents were, by modern standards, alarmingly common. In 1860, a locomotive derailed at Tottenham Station, killing 9 people. A year later, 23 passengers were killed and hundreds were injured when a signalling error led to a collision in the Clayton Tunnel near Brighton. In June 1864, 2 trains filled with racing enthusiasts from Ascot collided at Egham Station, killing 5 and seriously injuring another 25. Between petty crime and fatal collisions, trust in the railways was at an all-time low. Just when it seemed as if things couldn't get worse, the first railway murder in history happened right in the heart of London, unlocking a new fear for passengers and sparking an international manhunt to bring the killer to justice. Just after 10 p.m. on July the 9th, 1864, two bank clerks boarded North London Railway first-class carriage 69 at Hackney Station. Harry Verners and Sidney Jones worked together in the banking house, Messrs. Roberts and Co., and were both headed for Highbury. Harry took a seat in a compartment on the right-hand side of the carriage. Sidney saw a black bag in the left-hand side seat and tossed it onto another seat before settling in. But his hand that touched the cushion of the seat came away wet, and he realised that it was spattered with blood. The two clerks called for help, and a nearby station guard fetched a lamp and ran into the carriage. Blood smears were found on some of the seat cushions and on the quarter light, a small window that let light and air into the carriage. In addition to the black bag Sidney had moved to sit down, the guard found a walking stick and a flattened hat with blood on it. The guard locked the carriage doors and sent a telegraph to Chalk Farm Station, requesting an inspector meet him there. At Chalk Farm, Inspector George Greenwood examined the carriage, ordered it detached, and sent it to Bow Station for safekeeping. He gathered up the hat, stick, and bag, locking them inside an office with other unclaimed belongings. At this point, the discovery of the bloody carriage was disturbing, but it was not yet necessarily proof of a violent crime. After all, there was no sign of a victim. Minutes later, at 10:20 p.m, a guard on a train travelling the line in the opposite direction spotted something in the space between the north and southbound rails between Hackney and Bow stations. The guard asked the engine driver to stop the train and hopped down to investigate. He found a man lying on his back and unconscious with severe head injuries. The injured man was carried to a nearby pub and a doctor was sent for. Within an hour, two physicians had rushed to the pub to help, but there was little to be done for the injured man. In addition to jagged cuts and scrapes from the fall onto the tracks, the man had deep wounds on the top of his head. A police inspector searched the victim's pockets for clues to his name or address. He was identified as Thomas Briggs. Ironically, the 70-year-old man served as chief clerk at the same bank where Harry Verners and Sidney Jones were employed. Briggs was passed into the care of his regular physician, who also concluded that nothing could be done to save his life. Briggs never regained consciousness and passed away late on July the 10th. An autopsy found extensive skull fractures with one temporal bone driven into the brain. The victim had been struck in the head with a blunt object multiple times, becoming the first man to be murdered on a railway car. With carriage 69 and its contents now key evidence in a homicide investigation, North London Railway quickly passed the items over to the Metropolitan Police. An officer took the hat, stick and bag to Thomas Briggs' home. There, the victim's son identified the stick and bag as his father's, but did not recognize the hat. The son told police that his father had left the house that morning wearing a gold pocket watch on an Albert chain and a pair of gold-rimmed eyeglasses. A piece of the chain was found still clipped to Briggs' waistcoat, indicating that the watch had been torn away violently. Examined in the light of day, the carriage proved to be much gorier than previously realized. The door of one compartment was smeared with blood and small pools of blood dotted the floor. The window handle bore a bloody handprint and the outside of the carriage was spattered with gore. On the step beneath the door, a piece of the hair guard from Briggs' glasses was found. A hair guard being a small piece of twine made of hair connected to the glasses so you wouldn't lose them. It appeared as though Briggs had been bludgeoned to death inside the carriage before his body was tossed from the window of the moving train. By Monday, June the 11th, Thomas Briggs' murder was national news. Anxious rail passengers demanded answers and argued for safety measures to protect riders. Petty theft was one thing, but murder was another. Thomas Briggs had not been a ruffian or a wretch. He was a gentleman travelling in a first-class carriage. If his safety wasn't guaranteed, no one's was. Under intense pressure, the Home Office offered a £100 reward for information about the crime, and Messrs. Roberts & Co. offered an additional £100. Soon after, investigators received a tip from a jeweller named, rather aptly, John Death, who ran a shop in Cheapside. Death said that on July the 11th, a German man had visited his shop to exchange a gold chain. The jeweller had examined the chain and weighed it, telling the German it was valued at £3.10. The German asked to exchange the chain for other items in Death's inventory and selected a different gold chain and a finger ring. The gold Albert chain the man traded matched the description of the one missing from Thomas Briggs' waistcoat. But aside from a description of the German customer, the police were no closer to learning the killer's identity. 2 weeks later, a cabman named Jonathan Matthews came forward with another tip. He told police that after reading a description of the suspect on a police station placard, he thought he recognized the man. He returned home to fetch a small cardboard jeweller's box with the name Death on it that an admirer of his eldest daughter had delivered several weeks earlier. His daughter's beau was a young German man named Franz Muller. Matthews had known Muller for over 2 years, having met him through a family member. The cabman said that during one visit, Muller had admired his black beaver hat. Matthews had offered to buy a similar one for him in exchange for Muller, who was a tailor by trade, making him a waistcoat. Matthews believed that the hat found on the railway carriage was the one he'd purchased for Franz. It appeared that in his haste to flee the scene, he had taken Briggs' top hat by mistake and left his own behind. Armed with a name and an arrest warrant, police made hundreds of inquiries about Franz Muller. They learned that a man by the same name and description had boarded a ship bound for New York City on July the 15th. According to an agent at the North Quay, Muller had first come to the ticket office on July the 13th to inquire about passage to America. He'd purchased a one-way ticket for £4 on the packet ship Victoria. On July the 20th, 2 officers from the Metropolitan Police boarded a steamship in Liverpool bound for New York. With them was Jonathan Matthews and John Death, taken to identify the suspect so they could claim their reward. Though Muller had a 5-day head start, the Victoria was a sailing ship and much slower than the steamship. The SS City of Manchester arrived in New York on August the 5th, nearly 3 full weeks before Muller's ship was due to arrive. By the time the Victoria docked in New York's harbour, the London investigators had solicited help from the New York City Police Department and were able to board the ship before the gangplanks were lowered. Oblivious to the trap, Muller responded to the request from the ship's captain to meet him on deck and found himself face to face with 3 police officers. Muller's cabin was searched, revealing a gold watch matching the description of Thomas Briggs and a hat that also resembled the one Briggs usually wore. However, it seemed Muller had cut several inches off the top hat's crown to change its appearance. At the same time, multiple men were chosen from among the passengers and lined up with Muller in an impromptu identity parade. Matthews and Death were brought forward to view the lineup and immediately recognized Franz, who was arrested on the spot. In early September, he was extradited back to Britain to stand trial for murder. That trial began at the Old Bailey on October the 24th, 1864. There was plenty of evidence to tie the suspect to the crime, mainly that he'd had items matching the exact description of those belonging to Thomas Briggs after the murder. But the defence presented its own testimony and evidence to support Muller's innocence. Mr. Thomas Lee, who knew Briggs well, testified that on the night of the murder he'd seen Briggs in a first-class carriage with two men, one stout with light whiskers and the other tall and dark, moments before the train pulled away from the station. Neither of these men matched Muller's description. Muller claimed that at the time of the murder he'd been paying a visit to Mary Ann Eldred in Camberwell. A telegram showed that Muller had arranged a meeting with Mary Ann for 3 p.m. on July the 9th. Mary Ann had waited for Muller for hours before leaving the house at 9 p.m. The next morning, Mary Ann's landlady told her that Muller had come by at 9:30. The landlady testified that Muller had stayed for 5 or 10 minutes. The landlady noticed that Muller was wearing a slipper on one foot, and when she inquired about it, Muller told her that he'd injured it. If Muller left the Camberwell house after 9:30, it would have been nearly impossible for him to be on the train that Thomas Briggs boarded at Fenchurch Street around 9:45. It's believed that Mary Ann was a sex worker, explaining why her testimony and the testimony of her landlady was so quickly dismissed as unreliable. In the end, the jury found the evidence connecting Muller to the murder more convincing than his possible alibi. It took them only 15 minutes to find Muller guilty of murder, and he was sentenced to be hanged on November the 14th. 4 days before his scheduled execution, a deputation from the German Legal Protection Society met with the Home Office to request a stay of execution, claiming to have new evidence that could exonerate Muller. The deputation said they had eyewitness testimony that placed Muller in an omnibus at the time of the murder. The witness had even remembered that he wore a slipper on one foot. But the request was denied. There would be no reprieve for Franz Muller. Just before 8 a.m. in the morning of November the 14th, Muller was taken from his cell at Newgate Prison. Executioner William Calcraft fitted a leather belt around Muller's waist and strapped his wrists to it. He was led out the debtor's door where a crowd of 50,000 waited to watch him climb the steps of the gallows. Dr. Louis Kappel, a German-speaking priest, tried desperately to save Muller's soul, begging him to confess. After proclaiming his innocence, twice Muller said, "Ich habe es getan," or "I have done it." The priest told Muller solemnly, "Christ have mercy upon your soul," to which Muller replied, "My God, I feel sure of it." As the trapdoor opened beneath Muller's feet, the priest ran down the steps yelling, "Confessed! Confessed! Thank God." After a death mask was made, Franz Muller was buried in an unmarked grave inside Newgate Prison, but his legacy was far from over. It became quite fashionable among young gentlemen to wear a shortened top hat like the one Muller had altered. The style was known as the Muller cut-down hat and would later become one of Winston Churchill's most recognisable wardrobe items. Following the murder, changes were made to railway carriages to improve passenger safety. Small circular windows were installed between train compartments to increase visibility. These windows, called Muller Light, were not universally popular. Many passengers complained that the Muller lights infringed on their privacy. Following the Regulation of Railways Act in 1868, communication cords were installed that triggered a bell in the guard's compartment when pulled, alerting them to a possible emergency. Such a device may have saved Thomas Briggs' life. There's also some who claim that it was this case that led to the term to be mullered, meaning beaten severely. Whether this is true or not, it's clear that Franz Muller's name will live on in infamy as the first person to murder someone on a moving train. Our next crime tale is full of twists and turns, and though it occurred over 40 years ago, many believe there are still more to come. The Georgian farmhouse, known as White House Farm, on the outskirts of Tolleson Darcy, a small village in Essex, is no stranger to tragedy. Just after Christmas in 1892, 57-year-old farmer Benjamin Page stirred a heaped spoonful of mercuric chloride, a highly toxic compound used to treat sheep for parasites, into a glass of water. After 8 painful days of illness and paralysis, Benjamin Page died. During the inquest, a witness told the coroner Benjamin had lately suffered from his head and complained of the stormy weather. He could get no rest for the wind. The jury ruled that Frank had taken his own life while in an unsound state of mind. Nearly 60 years later, in 1950, Benjamin Page's son Frank vanished from the White House. A search party was formed, and a 77-year-old man was found lying on the surface of a water tank just 70 yards away from the house. While Frank's cause of death was heart failure, a jury concluded that he had climbed into the water tank with the intention of drowning himself, only to have his heart stop at the initial contact with the cold water. Frank's sister testified that he'd suffered from a nervous breakdown that summer and was in a low nervous state. Another death caused by mental illness at the White House farm. Tragic as the Page family story is, it remains a mere footnote to the horrors that unfolded at the property in 1985. And although a jury has concluded that the mass killing known as the White House Farm Murders was motivated by financial gain, recent developments in the case suggest that the massacre may actually be the heartbreaking result of another mental health crisis. In the early morning hours of August 7, 1985, 24-year-old Jeremy Bamber placed a call to Essex Police requesting that officers check on his family at White House Farm. According to him, his father, Neville Bamber, had called him to say that Jeremy's sister, Sheila, had gone berserk and had hold of one of his guns. Just before 4 a.m., a patrol car carrying 3 officers pulled into the long driveway leading up to the farm, with Jeremy Bamber arriving moments later. He told the officers that the night before he'd taken Neville's .22 Anschutz rifle out to shoot rabbits. He'd left the loaded gun in the kitchen and now believed his 27-year-old sister Sheila was using it to threaten their parents. Jeremy begged the officers to enter the home, but they insisted on waiting for backup, which didn't arrive for almost an hour. The squad surrounded the home and used a megaphone to ask Sheila to surrender. 2.5 hours later, officers finally entered the silent house through the back door. 61-year-old Neville Bamber was lying in a puddle of blood near the kitchen hearth. Neville's wife, June Bamber, was slumped in an upstairs doorway. The couple's daughter, Sheila Caffel, was lying dead in the room behind June. Down the hallway, Sheila's 6-year-old twin sons, Daniel and Nicholas, lay side by side in a blood-soaked bed. An officer was tasked with delivering the news to Jeremy Bamber. All 5 of his family members were dead. Jeremy sobbed and raged. He stumbled into a field and vomited. An officer escorted the sorrowful man to the small cottage he lived in, about 3 miles away from the farmhouse, and urged him to drink a cup of coffee and eat a bacon sandwich to help with the retching. Meanwhile, officers poured over the White House, processing the crime scene. The details that emerged were horrific. Neville had apparently died after a physical struggle with the shooter. His pajama bottoms were around his knees, and he'd fallen onto an overturned chair near the hearth with his head landing in the coal scuttle. He'd been shot 8 times, including 6 wounds to the head and face. Neville's body was bruised and battered, his eyes blackened and his nose broken. June had died in the doorway of the main bedroom. She'd been shot 7 times, one shot delivered at near point-blank range to her temple. Daniel Caffel had been shot 5 times in the back of his head. His brother Nicholas had been shot 3 times in the face. Sheila was lying on her back in the main bedroom. She had 2 bullet wounds under her chin. The rifle lay on her body, pointing toward the wounds. A Bible was propped open beside her, the pages open to Psalms 51 through 55. Detective Chief Inspector Taft Jones was placed in charge of the investigation. After reviewing the crime scene and discussing the bodies with the police surgeon and the coroner's office, Jones told his team he believed the case was a murder-suicide carried out by Sheila. As news of the murders passed through Tolleson Darcy, locals were shocked by the tragic fate of the Bamber family. Though Neville and June had always been reserved, they were well known and widely respected, considered local gentry in the rural Essex village. Neville was a former Royal Air Force pilot and a long-time magistrate at the local court. He married June Speakman in 1949, and the couple moved into the George and White House farm on Pages Lane, sitting on 300 acres that had belonged to June's father. Neville and June desperately wanted children but found they were unable to conceive. As a result, June suffered from depression and was admitted to a psychiatric hospital on multiple occasions. In 1957, the Bambers adopted an infant daughter, Sheila, from the Church of England Children's Society. But even the joy of a baby couldn't cure June's mental state. In 1958, she was readmitted to a psychiatric facility where she underwent at least 6 sessions of electroshock therapy and was eventually diagnosed with depression, psychosis, and paranoia. After her death, June's psychiatrist told police that her mental illness had caused the distortion of her already strong religious beliefs, so that she saw everything in terms of good and evil. The psychiatrist believed that this black and white worldview had caused great harm to June's relationship with Sheila. In 1961, the Bambers adopted a second child from the Children's Society, a 6-month-old boy named Jeremy. Despite June's struggles, Sheila and Jeremy enjoyed a mostly happy childhood. Their parents doted on them, and the family's wealth afforded them many privileges. When he was 9, Jeremy was sent to the prestigious Gresham School in Norfolk. By all accounts, he was a fairly lackluster student who clashed with school administrators for brewing beer and sneaking out to watch punk shows. Jeremy's boarding school experience was lonely. After finding out that he was adopted, his classmates dubbed him the bastard and treated him as an outcast. Still, according to him, his schooling awakened a deep interest in engineering, architecture, sculpture, and physics. In 1979, Neville paid for Jeremy to travel to Australia, where he found work on a sugar plantation in Queensland, took a scuba diving course, and then spent time in New Zealand. He returned to England in 1982, agreeing to work on his parents' farm for £170 a week. He lived rent-free in a cottage Neville owned in nearby Goldhanger. Neville also gave him a car to use and gifted him 8% of Osea Road Campsite, a family-owned business that ran a local caravan site. Sheila had attended Secretarial College in Swiss Cottage, London, but in 1974, at age 17, she began dating an artist named Colin Caffel and soon discovered she was pregnant. The Bambers arranged an abortion, but by then June's relationship with Sheila had soured. June's hard and fast rules about morality and sin had little leeway for Sheila's unconventional choices. After finding her and Colin sunbathing naked in a field on the family farm, June began referring to her daughter as the devil's child. Sheila trained as a hairdresser before signing with Lucy Clayton Charm Academy as a model. She had some success and was nicknamed Bambi, a play on her last name and her willowy limbs. Sheila became pregnant again in 1977, But this time, June and Neville insisted that she marry Colin in a rushed ceremony at a registry office. A few months later, Sheila miscarried. The Bambers bought the newlyweds a flat in Hampstead, hoping to ease Sheila's pain, but the marriage was turbulent, bordering on outright violence. Later, Colin said, "There were even times we could have killed each other." Sheila suffered a second miscarriage, which she viewed as divine punishment for what she referred to as her evil aura. In June 1979, after 4 months of strict bed rest, she and Colin welcomed twin boys Daniel and Nicholas. However, this positive occasion would also be tinged with tragedy. Colin had started an affair shortly before the birth and vanished for months before finally leaving the mother of his children for the other woman. Neville bought Sheila a new flat in the coveted Moorshead Mansions in Maida Vale, where she still managed to share parenting duties with Colin, who was living in nearby Kilburn. Sheila struggled to keep a job and relied on welfare payments to support her children. Her mental health deteriorated and she was plagued by paranoia. When the twins were 4, the Bambers paid for her to be treated at St Andrew's Hospital, the same expensive private facility where June had been treated with electroshock therapy nearly 3 decades earlier. There, she was diagnosed with schizoaffective disorder and discharged in September 1983. After her discharge, Sheila continued outpatient care under Dr. Hugh Ferguson, a psychiatrist who had also treated June. He would later tell police that Sheila had bizarre delusions and she thought her sons would seduce her and saw evil in them both. She also expressed concern that she might harm her children, including killing them, but Ferguson did not believe she posed a threat to the twins. Secretly, Sheila began skipping doses of her prescribed drugs and self-medicating with cannabis and cocaine instead. In the spring of 1985, she was readmitted to St Andrews after relapsing into an acute psychotic state. She believed that everyone around her was conspiring in an attempt by the devil to take away her godliness. After a few weeks, Dr. Ferguson discharged Sheila, prescribing an intravenous antipsychotic that would be administered monthly to ensure she didn't skip doses. But when receiving her most recent injection, Sheila had convinced the doctor to administer only a half dose. The day after the shootings, detectives held a meeting at White House Farm to discuss their findings. The team concluded that Sheila had suffered a mental breakdown or psychotic episode and had killed her family before turning the gun on herself. The pathologist confirmed that although Sheila did have 2 gunshot wounds under her chin, one was not immediately fatal, meaning that she would have been capable of pulling the trigger a second time. The officers were tasked with cleaning up the crime scene, and farm workers burned bloody mattresses, rugs and bedding. The case was effectively closed. But in another farmhouse, a different group of people was coming to drastically different conclusions about the deaths. June's sister, Pamela, was married to Robert Boutflower. Together with their children David Boutflower and Anne Eaton, the family decided it was impossible for Sheila, whom they described as feather-brained and uncoordinated, to have overpowered Neville in a physical fight. When Jeremy announced to the family that he'd spoken to an accountant who had advised him to consider selling off assets to pay inheritance taxes, the Boutflowers believed that they had found their motive. As the sole surviving Bamber, Jeremy stood to inherit the family's large estate, which consisted of multiple properties. The Boutflowers brought their suspicions to Chief Inspector Taft Jones, who refused to consider their points. On the same day, Anne Eaton visited Jeremy, who said he'd been unable to return to the White House since the deaths. Anne offered to serve as the official key holder for the crime scene. David, Anne, and Robert searched the White House for evidence. In a cupboard under the stairs, David found the silencer that was usually on Neville's rifle and a few hundred rounds of ammunition. Back at Anne's house, they examined the silencer more closely and spotted what appeared to be flecks of red paint and a jam-like blob of blood at the end. Robert told Essex police they'd found additional evidence, and 3 days later, an officer collected the silencer from Anne Eaton. The cousins also found a scratch on the red mantelpiece in the White House kitchen, believed to be from the silencer as the killer and Neville grappled for control of the rifle. In the weeks that followed, Jeremy Bamber agreed to return to White House with the Beltflowers, who were hoping his reaction to the crime scene would give him away. When Jeremy noticed that his cousins had removed many valuable items, he was angry and told them not to take anything else. Jeremy arranged for an appraiser to visit the farm, and soon afterward he began moving things to the cottage himself. Following his parents' and Sheila's funeral, Jeremy took a windsurfing vacation with a woman he'd just started dating. He also entertained an offer from a tabloid to sell nude photos of Sheila. While he was gone, the Beltflowers ran their own investigation at White House Farm, testing to see if it was possible to climb out of the kitchen window and lock it from the outside, and timing how long it would take to ride a bike from the farm to Jeremy's cottage. Robert Beltflower wrote a complaint to the Chief Constable of the Essex Police, who agreed to assign a high-ranking officer to review the evidence. But the review confirmed Taft Jones' original conclusion that Sheila had been the murderer. Then, a month after the murders, a witness emerged who changed everything. Julie Mugford, who was dating Jeremy at the time of the murders, had initially told police that Jeremy called her between 3 and 3:30 a.m. on August the 7th and told her there's something wrong at home before leaving to meet the police at the farm. But now, having recently broken up with Jeremy, Julie claimed that Jeremy had discussed killing his family for months before the murders. She said he felt Neville and June were trying to run his life and was annoyed that his parents continued to pay for Sheila's expensive London flat. Julie said that Jeremy had discussed dosing his parents with sleeping pills, shooting them, and then setting the house on fire, pinning the entire crime on Sheila. Julie also confessed to helping Jeremy rob the office at O.C. Road campsites a few months earlier. At the end of September, Jeremy Bamber was arrested and charged with 5 counts of murder after forensic tests showed the red paint on the silencer matched the red paint from the mantelpiece. What's more, blood on the silencer was found to be consistent with Sheila's blood group. Since Sheila could not have hidden the silencer after shooting herself, it was concluded that someone else was responsible for the mass murder. And Jeremy, with a motive, means, and second-hand confession, was the perfect perpetrator. On October the 28th, 1986, Jeremy Bamber was found guilty of 5 counts of murder and sentenced to life imprisonment with a recommendation to serve a minimum of 25 years. In 1994, his sentence was extended to a whole life tariff, meaning Jeremy will remain in prison until he dies. On one hand, the White House Farm murders reads like a classic amateur detective beats police at their own game adventure. A plucky group of relatives refuses to believe the investigators, hastily reach conclusion and solves the case themselves, bringing a perpetrator who committed horrific crimes to justice. Many people, including the numerous judges who have reviewed and denied Jeremy Bamber's multiple appeals, certainly think so. But a group calling itself the Jeremy Bamber Innocence Campaign believes that Jeremy was wrongly convicted and is fighting to have his sentence overturned. And in recent years, investigative journalists, documentarians, and volunteers have unearthed information that has made the case against Jeremy Bamber much murkier. His conviction rests on a few key pieces of evidence. The first is the blood and paint on the silencer. DNA evidence was not widely used in 1985, so investigators concluded the blood on the silencer was Sheila's because it matched her blood type. An expert concluded that the blood was backspatter from the gunshot wounds on Sheila's throat. And because tests confirmed that Sheila would have been unable to reach the trigger to shoot herself if the silencer was attached, it was reasoned that Sheila was murdered. Likewise, an expert concluded that paint on the silencer matched paint on the mantelpiece, showing that Jeremy, much bigger and stronger than Sheila, had fought with Neville in the kitchen before moving upstairs to kill the rest of the family before hiding the silencer. But in 2001, DNA tests on the silencer failed to find a match to Sheila's profile. DNA was found for two other unidentified people, but police were unable to compare it with the original evidence since the 1985 sample had been destroyed after the case was closed. The Court of Appeals dismissed the DNA evidence, claiming that Sheila's blood could have been degraded by the passage of time and that the other profiles could belong to anyone who handled the silencer during the investigation and trial. Many DNA experts refute this analysis, since investigators had testified to finding a considerable quantity of Sheila's blood on the silencer. The second pillar of the prosecution's case was Julie Mugford's testimony. She told the jury that she'd concealed Jeremy's crimes because she was afraid of him. Julie testified that just before 10 o'clock on August the 6th, Jeremy had called to tell her he'd been thinking about killing his parents all day, and it was tonight or never. There were serious problems with Julie's credibility, however. Not only was she a scorned ex, but she had confessed to robbing the campsite office and had been accused of check fraud and selling cannabis. After agreeing to testify, prosecutors had elected not to pursue the other charges against Julie. The judge cautioned the jury to review Julie's testimony with a great deal of caution, but allowed the prosecution to tell the jury that she had not sold her story to the tabloids, which they argued proved her credibility. Immediately after the verdict, though, Julie accepted £25,000 in exchange for an exclusive interview with the News of the World. The other crucial witness at trial was Dr. Ferguson, who testified that he did not consider Sheila capable of harming her parents or children, despite admitting that she had discussed that exact scenario as a fear before. A year after Jeremy's conviction, Dr. Ferguson assessed a teacher named Paul Paget Lewis, who was accused of stalking a 14-year-old student named Amit Osman. Paget Lewis followed the boy home, gave him money, and took photographs of him. At police request, Ferguson interviewed the teacher 3 times, but concluded that he was not mentally ill and should be allowed to keep his job. When the teacher threw a brick through Amit's window and slashed the tyres on his father's car, Ferguson suggested that he be transferred to another school. Less than a year later, Paul Paget Lewis went on a shooting spree. He shot and killed Amit's father and seriously injured Amit. Then he went to the house of the school's deputy head and seriously injured him before shooting and killing the deputy head's son. When he was arrested, Paget Lewis said, "Why didn't you stop me before I did it? I gave you all the warning signs." If Ferguson had ignored the warning signs with Paul Paget Lewis, isn't it probable that he also ignored the warning signs with Sheila? The jury also heard testimony from witnesses who said that following the murders, Jeremy had behaved strangely. He'd broken up with Julie and immediately started dating someone new, had taken several international vacations, and considered selling nude photos of his dead sister. He'd also moved quickly to have valuables appraised and seemed eager to begin selling the Bambas' properties. Jeremy has insisted that his behaviour is not an indication of guilt. He said he was taking significant quantities of Valium and drinking heavily to cope with his grief. and that he'd only started removing items from the White House after realizing his cousins were taking things, which he said felt like they were pecking my mum's eyes out. Speaking of the cousins, there were many details about the Boutflowers that the jury was not privy to at trial. Robert Boutflower had always been critical of Jeremy, whom he found disrespectful. In his diary, Robert had complained that Jeremy had scorned the Young Farmers Club, to which most farmers' sons belonged, and had described Jeremy as a degenerate with a constant craving for money. When Robert learned that Neville was planning to hand over the farm to Jeremy, he urged his brother-in-law to throw the bugger out. The Bambers and the Boutflowers were not emotionally close, but were intertwined by family business ties. The Boutflowers were co-owners of the campsite where Jeremy had stolen nearly £1,000. June's elderly and ill mother, Mabel Speakman, lived in a mansion called Vaulty Manor. Mabel also owned the farm where Robert and Pamela Boutflower lived. Anne Eaton had long dreamed of living at Vaulty Manor and was hoping to use the profits from a family-owned 50-acre farm called Little Renters that Neville had purchased at Anne's request to buy the manor after Mabel's death. But a few weeks before the murders, Jeremy told Anne that his father was considering buying Vaulty themselves after selling Little Renters. After June's death, Jeremy stood to inherit half of Mabel Speakman's estate, giving him ownership rights not just to Vaulty Manor, but to Robert and Pamela's home, and to Anne's future plans as well. Robert Boutflower convinced Mabel, who was quite literally on her deathbed, to cut Jeremy out of the will. But the Boutflowers could do nothing about Little Renters or the other properties that Jeremy stood to inherit as June and Neville's sole heir. The only exception was, of course, if Jeremy was convicted of murder, which would exclude him from the inheritance. The Boutflowers would then inherit all of Mabel Speakman's properties, the Bambers' properties, and the family businesses, which included the campsite and the profitable 300-acre farm. 4 weeks without police oversight, the Boutflowers had collected evidence, run experiments, and extracted family heirlooms from the White House. Jurors never learned that it was Robert Boutflower's theory of the murder, nearly word for word, that the prosecution had built its case on. There is other evidence that Jeremy Bamber and his supporters hope will someday exonerate him, like eyewitness testimony from officers who initially reported seeing a person moving around the farmhouse after they arrived on the scene, and the fact that at trial, Neville's struggle with the killer was framed as the tussle of a strong, able-bodied farmer, when in fact crime scene evidence showed he'd been shot several times upstairs before coming downstairs to grapple with the killer, meaning he'd been badly injured already. But the true key to Jeremy's guilt or innocence may lie in long-lost phone records. On the night of the murders, Essex police created 2 separate records of calls about White House Farm. At 3:36 a.m., an officer recorded Jeremy's call in which he said Neville had told him, "Your sister has gone crazy and has the gun." But another record, time-stamped at 3:26 a.m., seemed to summarize a call from Neville Bamber himself. The message read, "Daughter has got hold of one of my guns." The police have said that both documents referred to Jeremy Bamber's call and that the duplication of the record and the mismatched timestamps were a paperwork error. But that's not the only discrepancy. After Jeremy told police about Neville's frantic call, the kitchen phone in the White House had been left off the hook. An operator at the phone company was assigned to listen to the open line. She heard a dog barking and slight movements before transferring the open line to the police station. Police say they began monitoring the line at 6:09 a.m. Investigative journalist Heidi Blake found in Scotland Yard review records a mention of a 999 call from the farmhouse at 6:09 p.m. Investigators assigned to look into the call turned over a short statement from an Essex police officer, Nicholas Milbank, who said he'd monitored the open line and had heard nothing until the officers entered after 7:30. But the statement was unsigned. Instead, Milbank's name had been typed at the bottom. Heidi Blake contacted Milbank, who told her, "From what I can remember, someone phoned 999 from inside the farmhouse." The caller had not spoken, but he'd heard some muffled speech and noises. Milbank also said he'd never been asked to write a statement about the call. If someone did call 999 from the White House kitchen phone at 6:09 a.m., it would prove that Jeremy Bamber was not the killer. At that time, he was standing outside the house with the police. As of now, the Criminal Cases Review Commission has declined to refer Bamber's case to the appeal court. Milbank, who was never interviewed by the CCRC, had since passed away. Without his testimony, Jeremy Bamber is unable to prove he has an alibi for the time the killer was still moving around the house. Those who believe his claims of innocence remain hopeful that other exculpatory evidence will someday set him free. Until such time, we have only the decisions of the court that found Jeremy guilty of killing his parents, sister, and nephews in a bid to inherit the family's estate. Today, White House Farm remains a family home. Coincidentally, its current inhabitants are Jeremy's cousin and her husband, Anne and Peter Eaton. Our next two stories take place in the United States, and we begin with the lesser-known story of the man who stalked Hollywood. In 1939, Los Angeles, a series of brutal attacks on young women rattled the city, leaving residents afraid and police scrambling for answers. The violence ranged from vicious assaults to murder, all carried out seemingly at random. When one man, DeWitt Clinton Cook, was eventually found to be connected to several of these crimes, it would lead to a trial that would not only determine his fate, but also make legal history in the state of California. DeWitt Clinton Cook was born in Waterloo, Iowa, and signs of what was to come showed up in his early life when he had several brushes with the law. He never completed high school, instead finding himself on a path toward petty crime that ultimately led to an 11-month stint at the Iowa State School for Boys. He was paroled, but the experience offered little in the way of rehabilitation. At the age of 16, Cook moved with his parents to Los Angeles. Shortly after their relocation, tragedy struck. His father died in a car accident, leaving the family without the patriarch and forcing young Cook to grow up too fast. By 1938, at just 20 years old, he had entered into marriage with Lorraine Levy, his first cousin. The wedding took place in Tijuana, Mexico, and was followed by a second ceremony in October at the downtown Los Angeles chapel. The couple settled down in a home at 1300 North Sycamore Avenue, where they lived with Cook's mother, 45-year-old Ruby. Cook worked as a printer for a Hollywood trade paper, earning a modest $24 a week, a salary that barely covered living expenses in a city that was rapidly becoming the heart of the entertainment business. He was outwardly ordinary. He was a young husband, a low-wage employee, and a son living with his mother, but below the surface he had a dark side, one that would soon bubble to the surface with deadly consequences. It was a Friday evening on the campus of Los Angeles City College. There was a college play being prepared with students and performers rehearsing or heading home. One of those was 32-year-old Anya Susoyeva. Anya was a student and a performer. She was walking alone near one of the campus paths, taking a well-trodden route that she had no doubt wandered along many times before. There was nothing unusual or risky about it. It was just another part of a normal day. However, this time something was different, something she hadn't noticed. DeWitt Cook was laying in wait. According to his later confession, he wasn't there for class or work or anything legitimate. He said he had been looking for a house to burgle but couldn't find one that looked easy or promising. After giving up on that, he drifted toward the campus. Somewhere near one of the benches along the walkway, he found a loose piece of 2x4 timber. He claimed it was not something he brought with him, not something planned. It was just sitting there and he picked it up. A little after 9 p.m., he saw Anya walking along the paved path. She didn't know she was being pursued. She was further unaware of the improvised weapon he now wielded or the dark intentions he had in mind. Cook trailed her for a short distance and then, without warning, hit her in the back of the head with the block of wood. The blow was strong enough to knock her to the ground and fractured her skull. DeWitt later admitted that he dragged her or carried her a short distance to a nearby tree, far enough that anyone passing on the path might not notice her. But she began to make sounds, moaning as if trying to speak or cry out for help. Cook pressed his hand over her mouth to silence her, but panicked when she kept making noise. Eventually, he ran from the scene, leaving Anya there, gravely injured, but still alive. He never took her purse, and the robbery that supposedly motivated the attack never happened. Minutes later, a campus police officer found her inside the administration building, barely conscious, her face blooded and bleeding from her ear, whispering only 4 words, "Oh, he hit me." She was rushed to an emergency hospital where doctors tried to save her, but the injuries she sustained were too severe. She died around 1:20 a.m. And just like that, a random, ordinary walk across campus became the center of a homicide investigation. The investigation that followed moved pretty quickly in some ways and slowly in others. Within hours of finding Anya, campus officials and police started searching the grounds. They found the piece of 2x4 leaning against a tree with strands of blonde hair stuck to it. They also found a pair of gloves, the right one with blood on it, the left with both blood and lipstick. The lipstick matched the lipstick inside Anya's handbag. There were blood spots found on the walkway and footprints nearby. The crime scene made it clear to investigators that this wasn't an accident, it was an attack. But early on, there wasn't a suspect or concrete trail of clues to follow. Los Angeles in the late 1930s didn't have the kind of forensic tools we have today. There was no DNA testing or digital surveillance. Most criminal cases came down to witness testimony, confessions, or physical clues that were more circumstantial than definitive. On March the 28th, 1939, just a month after Anya Susoyeva was killed, another young woman walked home from an evening at the movies near her Hollywood neighborhood. Her name was Delia Bogart, a dancer and bit player at a film studio. As she walked home that night, she sensed someone behind her, following. But before she could react, a figure lunged out of the dark and struck her across the head with a piece of timber nearly identical to the 2x4 scantling left near Anya's body. Delia screamed and her attacker fled before he could finish whatever he had intended to do. Neighbors rushed out when they heard the commotion and found Delia collapsed and bleeding, drifting in and out of consciousness. She was rushed to the hospital with a severe head injury and would remain under care for weeks before moving back in with her parents. Police found a piece of wood discarded nearby. Again, a blunt object, and again a young woman attacked with seemingly no motive. But at that time, no one had thought to connect this case to that of Anya Susoyeva. In the early summer, another violent crime shook the city, one even more brutal than the assault on Delia Bogart. Margaret Campbell was an actress and had a film career in the late 1910s with her German-born actor husband Joseph Swickard. She appeared in at least 24 silent films throughout her career. On June the 27th, 1939, she was found sexually assaulted and bludgeoned to death with a hammer. It was a devastating scene and jolted both investigators and those who knew her. The brutality seemed to echo earlier attacks. A female victim, a weapon used with ferocious force, and no clear motive. Investigators quickly focused on her son, 25-year-old Charles MacDonald Campbell, and he became the primary suspect in her murder. Unlike the other assaults and murder that year, this one had a direct familial connection. While Charles Campbell's guilt in his mother's murder was certain, and he would later be committed to Mendocino State Hospital for the criminally insane, investigators also initially suspected he might be connected to the other unsolved attacks, including the death of Anya Susoyeva and the attack on Delia Bogart. For weeks, there was a shadow of suspicion over him, but while investigators believed they had likely caught the man responsible for these crimes, the actual attacker continued to wander Los Angeles. By late August, officers had no suspect for Anya's murder and no resolution for Delia's assault. Then, on August 24, 1939, the same old pattern emerged, this time inside a private residence. 17-year-old Myrtle Wagner worked as a domestic for Mr. and Mrs. M. Lipman. That Thursday evening, she sat in the kitchen crocheting a towel. It was a quiet, ordinary night until a man stepped inside. Before Myrtle could react, the man clubbed her. One blow, then another. The assault was so vicious and brutal that she needed a cane for weeks afterward. Unlike Delia, Myrtle had no chance to scream, and the attack was so sudden. But something startled him. Perhaps footsteps in another room, and he quickly fled the scene. The attack forced the LAPD to confront the unmistakable fact that a pattern was emerging. It was the same method, blunt force, and the same type of victim in the same general geographic area. Captain Dalton R. Patton and Deputy Chief Homer B. Cross ordered immediate increases in patrols. Officers were given descriptions, timelines, and instructions to canvass neighborhoods aggressively. No one had forgotten the Anya Susoyeva murder. No one wanted a fourth victim. Just 4 nights after the assault on Myrtle Wagner, investigators would catch a break when, on August the 28th, 1939, Mr. and Mrs. W.F. Warnock were relaxing in their Hollywood home on Oakwood Avenue. Mrs. Warnock had just finished dressing to go play badminton with friends, while her husband sat in the front room with their young daughter and their dog. As Mrs. Warnock returned to their front room to retrieve a hat she had forgotten, she froze. Standing in front of the dresser was a stranger, a man in a brown suit. She screamed, and the intruder reacted immediately, leaping toward an open window. He vanished into the night before her husband could reach him. Sergeants E.L. Berger and A.D. McCool canvassed the neighborhood and soon located a suspect a short distance from the Warnock home. They found DeWitt Clinton Cook, an 18-inch piece of wood, a long screwdriver, pocket knife, and several pairs of gloves on his person. His shoes, tennis shoes, were later confirmed to match footprints left at Myrtle Wagner's assault scene. Investigators extended their search to Cook's home, where they discovered an additional pair of moccasin shoes. The soles of these shoes matched perfectly the unusual footprint pattern found beside Delia Bogart's unconscious body. At that moment, police finally had the break they had been waiting for. The scattered, brutal attacks across Hollywood could be traced back to one man, DeWitt Clinton Cook. When Cook was arrested and placed in the back of a police car, officers noticed he reacted strangely to a piece of wood sitting on the seat. A apparently a leftover scrap from a repair job the police had done earlier. When Cook saw it, he reportedly said, "My God, not that." After he was taken into custody, investigators were quick to interrogate him. Aware of the mounting evidence against him, they confronted him with the growing trail of crime that stretched back to Anya Susuyeva's murder in February. Cook initially denied involvement but couldn't withstand the persistent questioning combined with the mounting physical evidence. Gloves, shoes, weapons, footprints and eyewitness descriptions. After hours of intense questioning, Cook finally confessed. He admitted to the murder of Anya Susuyeva, the attacks on Delia Bogard and Myrtle Wagner, and other minor burglaries and assaults. In his own chilling words, he described Anya's murder, saying, "She screeched a little, so I hit her some more. Then she only moaned." Cook's confession was thorough, covering multiple assaults and murders, and investigators later found his story aligned closely with the physical evidence collected at each scene. By the time the case went to trial on October 4th, 1939, public attention had grown. Hollywood, already accustomed to sensational news from the film industry, followed every development of the case with fascination. The prosecution was led by Deputy District Attorney Eugene U. Blaylock, while Cook's defense team consisted of Deputy Public Defenders Elric Cuff and William B. Neely. A jury of 12 men was seated to hear the case. One of the most unprecedented aspects of Cook's trial occurred on October the 11th. For the first time in California history, sound motion pictures were used during a trial to aid the prosecution's case. The jurors watched Cook himself reenact the murder of Anya Susuyeva, speaking to officers and demonstrating how he had struck her on the head. The combination of photographs, crime scene footage, and reenactments with audio explanations allowed the jury to experience the events in a way never before possible in the state's judicial system. Members of the jury later confirmed in chambers that the visual and audio evidence assisted them in understanding several points of the case. The trial moved quickly, and by October 13th, the jury had deliberated for only 40 minutes before returning a guilty verdict. The case was widely regarded as one of the strangest in criminal law at the time, largely because Cook offered no defense, never denied the murder, and did not enter a plea of not guilty. The courtroom and public alike were struck by his cold, almost indifferent demeanor throughout the proceedings. On October the 18th, 1939, Judge Ambrose sentenced Cook to death in the gas chamber at San Quentin Prison. He was transported by train to San Quentin on October the 26th, 1939, where he awaited his fate. He filed an appeal, which was denied, and on May the 24th, 1940, his wife successfully obtained an annulment of their marriage. In a final plea for clemency sent to California Governor Culbert L. Olson on July 22, 1940, Cook wrote, "If I were older by 20 years, I would perhaps not wish for a commutation, but I am a young man still. To me, life is life, whether in a penitentiary or elsewhere. I stand convicted of murder, but I am not a murderer in my heart. Surely this is the contingency for which the alternative penalty was prepared. There is no doubt in my mind that when my term expired, I would emerge a better man in all ways, spiritually, mentally, and physically." Governor Olson granted a temporary reprieve on November the 25th, 1940, and Cook submitted a formal clemency request on December the 30th. The petition was denied on January the 5th, 1941, and at 10:02 a.m. on January the 31st, DeWitt Clinton Cook was executed. The Times reported that in his final hours, Cook had listened to a small radio throughout the night, made no attempt to sleep, and refused breakfast. He told a guard that night before his execution, I have made up my mind. I have to go. That is all there is to it. DeWitt Clinton Cook's crimes left a trail of fear and devastation across Hollywood, but his capture and conviction brought a small measure of closure to the community. His trial was groundbreaking for its use of sound motion pictures and set a precedent in California legal history. And although ultimately justice was carried out, over the years, the case seems to be remembered more for its unusual trial than the crimes themselves. Our final story is a shocking one that is almost as notable for how quickly it was seemingly forgotten. In late August and early September of 1961, a devastating crime spree cut across the Midwest and into Texas, leaving multiple fatalities in its wake. The case involved an unlikely and deeply troubling pairing, a 32-year-old ex-convict with a long criminal record and a 13-year-old runaway. Over the course of just a few days, the two committed multiple murders, including the shooting death of a hitchhiker picked up along the road. The violence unfolded quickly and without warning, crossing state lines before authorities fully understood what they were chasing. Within days, the case would raise unsettling questions about how a child became involved in a murder and how the law would respond. John Edwin Myers was no stranger to the criminal justice system by the time of the 1961 killings. According to FBI records and later court testimony, he had been imprisoned multiple times before the age of 35. His history included military discipline issues, auto theft, child abandonment, and repeated periods of incarceration. In 1948, while in military service, Myers was charged with being absent without leave and striking a senior officer. He was sentenced to 3 years and 6 months in the United States Disciplinary Barracks in Portsmouth, New Hampshire. The following year, he was sentenced to 1 to 3 years in the Nebraska State Reformatory for auto theft and released in September of 1951. In 1954, he was again sentenced, this time in St. Cloud, Minnesota, for child abandonment, serving approximately 2 years. By 1961, Myers was a father of 5 and had little stability. He lived a transient existence and frequently engaged in criminal behavior. Witnesses and later psychiatric testimony described him as manipulative, impulsive, and capable of extreme violence. At the time of the crimes we're exploring today, he was already an ex-convict with little to lose and no clear means of support. Donna Marie Stone was just 13 years old when the crime spree began. She came from a large family, being one of 7 children, and was considered by those who knew her to be more immature than her peers. According to testimony later presented in court, she was not permitted to date and had a reputation for good moral character within her community. Stone had been living with her grandparents in Edwardsville, Illinois, during the summer of 1961. Myers, a friend of her father and a resident of the same apartment building as the Stone family, followed her to Edwardsville shortly before the murders. At some point, the young girl ran away from her grandparents' home and joined Myers. Within days of leaving Edwardsville, the pair enacted a brutal series of crimes that left a trail of death across 3 states. On the evening of August the 30th, 1961, George Ballard, 47, and his daughter Carol, 10, were fishing near Emga Lake, a small fishing pond west of Belleville, Illinois. They had no reason to believe they were in any danger. Myers and Stone, who had been camping near the pond, saw the Ballards as an opportunity. According to statements later signed by both defendants, the pair wanted money and a vehicle. They intended to travel to Arizona, where Stone reportedly said they planned to pick cotton for work. The Ballards was seen as an easy target. They were overpowered and bound with a plastic clothesline, with their hands being tied behind their backs. Despite being at their robber's mercy, the pair were then shot in the head, executed. For their wicked efforts, Myers and Stone obtained only $1. They were also unable to start Ballard's car, leaving them stranded and forcing them to continue on foot. The killings at Emger Lake marked the beginning of a pattern. Victims restrained, shot at close range, and left where they fell. After failing to take the Ballard's vehicle, Myers and Stone walked to the nearby home of Mr. and Mrs. H.P. Graham. At gunpoint, they took Mr. Graham's car and forced Margaret Wernicke, 39, who had lived with the Grahams for 22 years, to accompany them. Wernicke was employed in the addressograph department of Sticks, Bear and Fuller, and had been at the Graham residence when Myers and Stone arrived. She was not a random passerby, but a person pulled into the violence through proximity and circumstance. Shortly after 9 p.m., Wernicke made a telephone call to Mr. Graham from a public booth on Market Street in Belleville. During that call, she said Myers told her he planned to drive about 50 miles to see his father and then surrender. This suggested that Myers likely made a promise he never intended to keep, and instead of surrendering, he and Stone headed south, Wernicke still in tow. Somewhere in Oregon County, Missouri, they stopped along a gravel road near Thayer. According to their signed statements, John and Donna took Wernicke into a field approximately 150 feet from the road and tied her hands. What followed was as methodical as it was wicked. Stone fired 2 shots into Wernicke's head. Myers then fired 2 more, finishing her off, as the statement described. A preliminary examination later indicated that up to 5 shots had been fired. After her murder, Wernicke's body was then concealed under brush. She had been robbed of $16 before she was killed. The killing demonstrated a clear escalation. Wernicke wasn't a hostage or a means of escape, but someone the pair decided could not be allowed to live. The final murder occurred late on the night of September the 1st, 1961. Myers and Stone picked up a hitchhiker, 33-year-old Arthur Lee DeCry, near the Fort Worth area. DeCry from Ottumwa, Iowa, sat in the front seat between them and eventually fell asleep. According to the confession, Myers fired a shot into DeCry's hand while he slept. Stone later stated that they believed he had money, but he didn't have a penny. Both Myers and Stone admitted to again firing 2 shots each into DeCry. His body was left between Big Spring and Midland, Texas. Shortly after midnight, Texas Highway Patrolman Jack Reeves stopped the rampaging pair after recognizing their stolen car from a description broadcast in connection with the Belleville murders and kidnapping. The crime spree ended as abruptly as it had begun. When arrested, Myers and Stone appeared calm and relieved, according to law enforcement accounts. At the time of the arrest, Stone was wearing some of Margaret Wernicke's clothing. Their capture led quickly to confessions covering all 4 murders. The statements were detailed and signed, forming the foundation for the prosecution's case across multiple jurisdictions. But these confessions would later become a focal point of legal challenge. Defense attorneys argued that the statements were coerced and taken under circumstances that violated due process. Courts would ultimately examine the confessions under pre-Miranda standards, focusing on voluntariness rather than the presence of counsel or warnings. Despite these challenges, courts consistently found that the confessions were admissible. The crimes spanned Illinois, Missouri, and Texas, creating immediate jurisdictional complications. In Texas, Howard County District Attorney Gil Jones filed a murder warrant against Myers for the killing of DeCry, but declined to charge Stone at that time because of her age. He stated that she would be held as a juvenile with the intention of filing charges once she reached adulthood. In Illinois, St. Clair County State's Attorney John M. Carnes filed murder warrants against both Myers and Stone for the Ballard killings. Federal kidnapping charges were also pending in connection with Wernicke's abduction. Texas sought to retain custody of Myers to prosecute him for murder. Illinois officials traveled to Texas to assert jurisdiction over the Belleville killings. Myers would ultimately face prosecution in multiple states, while Stone's case proceeded under Illinois' juvenile law. Donna Marie Stone was charged with the murder in Illinois of George and Carol Ballard. Her trial began amid intense public attention. The prosecution listed 31 witnesses, but only 2 testified before there was a turn of events. As the trial got underway, Stone changed her plea to voluntary manslaughter. Judge Richard T. Carter accepted the plea and placed her in the custody of the Illinois Youth Commission, ordering her confined at the Illinois State Training School for Girls in Geneva until discharged. Under Illinois law at the time, minors committed to the Youth Commission could be held for an indeterminate period. There was no fixed sentence length. During proceedings, testimony emphasized Stone's youth and background. The superintendent of schools testified that her IQ was 107, slightly above average, while her pastor testified that she had a good moral reputation. Prosecutors stated that in the confessions, Myers admitted to shooting the Ballards, while Stone admitted to only tying their hands. Donna was eventually paroled in 1968, and according to reports, by 1976, she was living in anonymity, married with a child of her own. John Edwin Myers was convicted in Texas for the murder of Arthur Lee DeCry and sentenced to death, though that sentence was later overturned. In Illinois, he was tried for the murder of Carol Ballard and found guilty on February 25, 1964. For this, he was again sentenced to death. This sentence would eventually be revisited as courts scrutinized jury instructions, evidentiary rulings, and constitutional issues. Myers' defense raised an insanity claim supported by psychiatric testimony. The prosecution countered with its own experts. The jury rejected the insanity defense, finding Myers legally responsible for his actions. In 1976, after years of appeals and examination of the laws around his sentencing, Myers' death sentence was commuted to a term of 75 to 150 years in prison. In the end, the crime spree carried out by John Edwin Myers and Donna Marie Stone lasted only days, but its consequences stretched across decades. 4 people, George Ballard, Carol Ballard, Margaret Wernicke, and Arthur Lee DeCry, lost their lives in acts of calculated violence. Families were left without answers that could ever fully explain what happened or why. What made the case impossible to ignore wasn't just the number of victims, but how quickly everything unraveled. In the span of a few days, a stolen car, a roadside stop, and a handful of signed confessions revealed a trail of killings that crossed state lines and left investigators racing to catch up. Today, the case has been largely forgotten outside of court records and aging newspaper archives, overshadowed by other crimes. But for the families involved, the impact never faded, even as the story slipped from public view. That brings this compilation to a close. And again, thank you to our patrons and channel members. If you'd like to enjoy early ad-free videos, please consider signing up. Right then, take care, and I'll see you next time with another story to make you say, well, I never.